The summer of 1892 had turned the Texas Panhandle into a furnace that seemed determined to burn the very soul out of the land. The grass had long since surrendered to the heat, curling into brittle threads of brown that crunched beneath boots like broken glass. The sky stretched overhead in a merciless expanse of white-blue, offering not a single cloud for shade or hope. And in the middle of this desolation sat the Barlow Ranch, a collection of weather-beaten buildings that had once been proud and now looked like the bones of something that had died and refused to lie down. Eleanor Barlow stood on the sagging porch of the main house, her hands gripping the railing that was more splinters than wood, and she watched the horizon with eyes that had learned not to expect anything good from it. She was 32 years old, though the lines carved into her face made her look closer to 50, and she had buried her husband William 6 months ago in the small cemetery behind the barn. The fever had taken him in 3 days, swift and cruel, leaving her with a ranch that was falling apart, a banknote that grew heavier with each passing week, and a loneliness that sat in her chest like a stone she could not swallow. The cattle were thin. The well was running low. The fence posts leaned at drunken angles, and the barn roof had developed a hole the size of a wagon wheel that let the rain in when it came and the heat out when it didn't. Eleanor had tried to keep up with the repairs, swinging a hammer until her hands blistered and her arms ached, but there was only so much one person could do, and the ranch seemed to mock her efforts, collapsing a little more each day like a dying animal refusing to be saved. She had considered selling. The banker in Amarillo had made it clear that he would take the land off her hands for a price that would barely cover the debt. But this ranch had been William's dream, built from nothing by his own father's hands, and Eleanor could not bear the thought of letting it go, of admitting that she had failed, of watching strangers walk through the rooms where she had loved and laughed and planned a future that would never come. So she stayed, she fought, and she prayed for a miracle she did not truly believe would arrive. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day when the heat shimmered off the ground in waves that made the distant mesas dance like ghosts, that Eleanor saw the figure approaching from the east. At first, she thought it was a mirage, one of those cruel tricks the desert played on desperate eyes, a wavering shape that would dissolve if she blinked. But it did not dissolve. It grew clearer, resolving into the form of a man walking with slow, deliberate steps, and behind him trailed 2 children, small and thin, their shadows stretching long across the cracked earth. Eleanor's hand went instinctively to the rifle that leaned against the porch post. Strangers were rare this far from town, and those who came were usually not the kind you wanted to find on your doorstep. Bandits, drifters, men with hard eyes and harder hands. She had learned to be careful, to trust slowly, to expect the worst. William had taught her that in the quiet moments before the fever took him, when he had held her hand and told her to be strong, to be watchful, to remember that the world was not always kind to women alone. The man was closer now, close enough that Eleanor could see the details of his appearance, and what she saw made her grip tighten on the rifle. He was tall, though he walked with a slight stoop, as if carrying a weight that bent his spine. His clothes were little more than rags, patched and repatched until the original fabric was barely visible beneath the layers of thread. His boots were worn through at the toes, and dust coated him from head to foot, turning his skin the color of the land itself. But it was his eyes that held her, even from a distance. They were dark and steady, with a depth that spoke of suffering endured and somehow survived, and they did not waver as they met hers across the dusty yard. The children were equally ragged, a boy and a girl, neither older than 8 or 9. The boy walked slightly ahead, his thin shoulders squared in a posture that tried to be brave. while the girl clutched a small bundle to her chest, her bare feet leaving faint prints in the dust. Their faces were pinched with hunger, the kind of hunger that Eleanor recognized from her own reflection in the mirror on mornings when she had given the last of the food to the animals and gone without herself. The man stopped at the edge of the porch, close enough to speak but far enough to show he meant no harm. He raised his hands slightly, palms out, a gesture of peace that Eleanor had seen before in the faces of men who had nothing left to lose. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was rough, cracked by thirst and dust. But there was a gentleness in it that made Eleanor's finger hesitate on the trigger. "I don't mean to trouble you. My name is Samuel Hartley, and these are my children, Jacob and Ruth. We've been walking for 3 days, and we haven't eaten since yesterday morning." Eleanor did not lower the rifle, but she did not raise it either. She looked at the children, at the way Ruth swayed slightly on her feet, at the hollows beneath Jacob's eyes, and she felt something twist in her chest. She had so little. The pantry held a single loaf of bread, half a jar of preserves, and some dried beans that she had been saving for an emergency she had not yet defined. The well was low and every drop was precious. But she could not turn away hungry children. She could not be the person who closed the door on need, no matter how desperate her own situation. "I don't have much," she said, and her voice came out harder than she intended, a shield against the softness that threatened to break through. "I can spare some water, maybe a little food, but I can't offer work, and I can't let you stay." Samuel nodded, as if he had expected nothing more. "I understand, ma'am. I wouldn't ask for charity. But I noticed your fence line as we approached. The posts are rotting and the wire is sagging. Your barn roof has a hole that'll let the winter rain ruin your hay and that well pump. I can hear it grinding from here. It's about to give out." Eleanor blinked, surprised by the specificity of his observations. She had not expected a man who looked like he had been dragged through hell to notice such details, to speak with the authority of someone who understood the language of land and labor. "I know the condition of my own ranch," she said, a touch of defensiveness creeping in. "I've been doing what I can." "I'm sure you have, ma'am," Samuel said, and there was no mockery in his tone, only respect. "But one person can't hold back the desert. It takes more hands than most folks have." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more intimate, as if sharing a secret. "Give my kids a loaf of bread, and I'll fix your ranch. Every fence post, every board, every nail. I'll work from sunup to sundown until it's done. You have my word." Eleanor stared at him, the rifle heavy in her hands. It was a foolish offer, too good to be true. The kind of promise that men made when they were desperate and broke when they were fed. She had heard such words before, from cowboys passing through, from neighbors offering help that never materialized, from William himself in the early days when everything seemed possible. She had learned that words were cheap, that the world took more than it gave, that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. But Ruth coughed, a small, dry sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest, and Eleanor saw the way Samuel's jaw tightened at the sound, the way his hand twitched toward the girl before he caught himself. She saw the love in his eyes, fierce and protective, the same love she had seen in William's eyes when he looked at her, and she knew that this man was not lying. He would work. He would keep his word, not for her, but for these children who depended on him, who looked at him with trust that he would somehow, against all odds, keep them alive. She lowered the rifle. "Come inside," she said, "but understand this. I don't have much. 1 loaf of bread, that's what I can spare. And water. You can sleep in the barn, but you'll work for every bite. If I find you're lying, if you're here to steal or cause trouble, I'll shoot you myself and bury you where no one will find you. Do we understand each other?" Samuel's mouth twitched, the ghost of a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Yes, ma'am. We understand each other perfectly." The bread was stale, 3 days old, the crust hard enough to hurt teeth. Eleanor cut it into careful slices, her hands trembling slightly as she portioned out what she had. She gave the children 2 slices each, watching them eat with a hunger that made her own stomach clench in sympathy. They did not wolf the food down as she expected, did not grab and devour like starving animals. Instead, they ate slowly, almost reverently, savoring each bite as if it were the finest meal they had ever tasted, and Eleanor felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes that she refused to let fall. Samuel ate his single slice in 3 bites, washing it down with water from the tin cup she provided. He did not ask for more, did not eye the remaining bread with the greed she had seen in other hungry men. He simply nodded his thanks, stood from the kitchen table, and asked where she kept her tools. That first afternoon, he worked on the fence line, replacing rotted posts with new ones he cut from the stand of mesquite behind the barn. The children helped as best they could, Jacob carrying water from the well, Ruth gathering the old nails that Samuel pulled from the decaying wood. They worked without complaint, without the whining Eleanor had expected from children so young, and she found herself watching them from the porch as she shelled beans, unable to look away from the strange tableau of this broken family laboring in her yard. By sunset, Samuel had repaired 20 feet of fence, the new posts standing straight and true, the wire pulled taut and secure. His hands were blistered and bleeding, his shirt soaked through with sweat. But when Eleanor brought him a second cup of water, he smiled at her, a real smile this time, one that transformed his gaunt face into something almost handsome. "Tomorrow I'll start on the barn roof," he said. "If you have some tar paper and shingles, I can patch it proper. If not, I'll use what I can find." Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She had not expected competence, had not expected this quiet dedication, this refusal to rest until the work was done. She had expected a man who would take her bread and disappear in the night, or one who would do the minimum and demand more. She had not expected Samuel Hartley. That night, she lay in the bed she had shared with William, listening to the sounds of the ranch, and, for the first time in months, she did not feel alone. The barn creaked in the wind, and somewhere in the darkness, she could hear the murmur of Samuel's voice as he talked to his children, telling them a story perhaps, or simply reassuring them that they were safe. The sound was foreign and familiar all at once, a reminder of what she had lost and a hint of what she might, against all reason, find again. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that Eleanor had not known she needed. Samuel rose before dawn, waking the children with gentle words, and they would eat the breakfast she prepared. Thin porridge, sometimes with a bit of salt pork if she had it, sometimes just the grain itself. Then they would work, all of them, the children doing what they could, Samuel doing what seemed impossible, and Eleanor moving between the house and the yard, cooking and cleaning, and helping where she was needed. The barn roof was patched by the end of the 3rd day, Samuel using old tin he found in the shed, and tar he mixed from supplies Eleanor had forgotten she owned. The well pump was repaired on the 5th day, Samuel's clever hands coaxing life back into the rusted mechanism with oil and patience and a knowledge of machines that Eleanor could only marvel at. The fence line stretched for half a mile, post after post replaced, wire after wire tightened, until the boundary of the Barlow Ranch stood strong against the wind and the wandering cattle. But it was not just the physical repairs that changed. Something else was happening, something Eleanor felt in the quiet moments when she caught Samuel looking at her across the dinner table. Something she saw in the way Ruth began to follow her around the kitchen, chattering about flowers and birds and the stories her mother used to tell, Jacob, solemn and watchful, slowly began to smile, began to trust, began to call her Miss Eleanor with a formality that made her heart ache. Samuel told her his story on the 7th evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. His wife, Clara, had died 2 years ago, taken by the same fever that had claimed William, leaving him with 2 children and a farm in Kansas that the drought had turned to dust. He had tried to hold on, had planted and prayed, and borrowed money he could not repay. But the land had betrayed him as surely as the weather, and in the end he had loaded what little they owned into a wagon and headed south, hoping to find work, hoping to find a place where his children could eat. The wagon had broken down outside Amarillo, the axle splitting on a hidden rock, the horse spooked by a rattlesnake and run off into the night. They had walked since then, sleeping in abandoned homesteads, eating what they could find, moving toward a future Samuel could not see but refused to stop believing in. "I was a carpenter before I was a farmer," he said, his voice soft in the gathering dark. "My father taught me. He used to say that every board had a purpose, every nail a place, and if you respected the wood, it would stand for 100 years. He turned to look at her, and in the fading light, his eyes were gentle. "Your ranch is good land, Eleanor. It just needs someone to believe in it again." Eleanor felt the tears come then, hot and sudden, and she did not try to stop them. She cried for William, for the future they had planned, for the loneliness that had been her only companion for 6 long months. She cried for Samuel and his children, for the suffering they had endured, for the love that had kept them walking when any other man would have lain down and died. And she cried for herself, for the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming, for the hope that was growing in her chest like a seed that had finally found water. Samuel did not touch her. He simply sat beside her, a silent presence, and let her weep. When she was done, he handed her his handkerchief, worn and patched but clean, and she wiped her face and laughed, a shaky sound that surprised them both. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't usually. I haven't." "You don't need to apologize," he said. "Grief is like rain. It has to fall sometime." By the end of the 2nd week, the ranch had transformed. The main house had been repainted, the peeling white restored to something that gleamed in the sun. The porch was reinforced, the steps rebuilt, the railing replaced with new wood that did not splinter. The corral was mended, the gate hung straight, the branding irons cleaned and organized. The garden, which Eleanor had neglected in her despair, was weeded and watered. The soil turned and enriched with compost Samuel made from the barn waste. But more than the buildings, more than the land, it was the life that had returned to the Barlow Ranch that struck Eleanor most deeply. Laughter echoed from the barn where Jacob and Ruth played among the hay bales. The smell of baking bread filled the kitchen, mixed with the scent of the wildflowers Ruth gathered each morning, and in the evenings, after the work was done, they would sit together on the porch. 4 people who had been strangers and were becoming something else. Something Eleanor did not have a name for, but knew she wanted to keep. The banker came on the 15th day, his black buggy kicking up dust as it rolled up the drive, his face set in the expression of a man who expected to collect a debt. He stopped when he saw the ranch, his eyes widening at the transformation, the straight fences, the painted house, the garden growing green and strong in the summer heat. "Mrs. Barlow," he said, tipping his hat with a politeness he had not shown before. "I see you've been busy." Eleanor stood on her porch, Samuel beside her, the children behind, and she felt a strength she had not known she possessed. "I had help," she said, "and I intend to keep it. You'll have your payment, Mr. Henderson, on time, in full. But this ranch is not for sale, and it never will be." The banker looked at Samuel, at the way he stood close to Eleanor without touching her, at the children who looked at her with the eyes of family, and something shifted in his expression. He nodded, a small gesture of respect, and climbed back into his buggy. "I'll look forward to your payment, Mrs. Barlow," he said, "and I believe I will. Good day." As the buggy disappeared down the road, Eleanor turned to Samuel, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. The sun was high and hot, the cicadas singing in the mesquite, and the world seemed to hold its breath. "You kept your word," she said. "The ranch is fixed, better than it was before." Samuel nodded, his eyes serious. "I did, but I find I don't want to leave. The children, they love it here. And he stopped, struggling with words that seemed too large for his voice. "I find I love it too. Not just the land, the life we've made, the people in it." Eleanor felt her heart beat faster, a rhythm that matched the pulse of the ranch around her. "Then don't leave," she said, and her voice was steady, sure, the voice of a woman who had learned to trust again. "Stay. Build something with me, not because you owe me, not because of any bargain, but because we choose to." Samuel reached out then, his hand finding hers, and his touch was warm and calloused and right. "I choose to," he said. "With all my heart, I choose to." The months that followed were not easy. The drought continued. The cattle market fluctuated, and there were nights when Eleanor lay awake worrying about the future. But she was not alone in her worry. Samuel was beside her, his hand in hers, his voice calm and steady, reminding her that they had faced worse and survived. They married in the spring, a simple ceremony in the church in Amarillo, the children dressed in clothes Eleanor had sewn by hand, the congregation small but genuine in their congratulations. The townspeople who had pitied the widow Barlow now looked at her with something like admiration, at the way she had turned despair into hope, at the family she had built from the ruins of loss. The ranch prospered. Samuel's carpentry skills found a market in town, and he built furniture that people drove miles to buy. Eleanor's garden grew into a small farm, selling vegetables to the restaurants in Amarillo that were hungry for fresh produce. Jacob learned to ride, to rope, to work the land with the skill of a boy who had found his place. Ruth grew tall and strong, her laughter ringing through the house, her drawings of flowers and animals covering every wall. And on summer evenings, when the heat had faded and the stars emerged in a sky so clear it seemed you could touch them, Eleanor and Samuel would sit on the porch they had rebuilt together, and they would talk about the day the stranger had come to her door with 2 hungry children and a promise that had changed everything. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked her once, his arm around her shoulders, his voice soft in the darkness. "Taking us in, sharing what little you had." Eleanor leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Never," she said. "That loaf of bread was the best investment I ever made. It bought me a family. It bought me a life. It bought me you." Samuel kissed her then, gently, the way he had kissed her 1,000 times since that first tentative touch, and when he pulled back, his eyes were bright with emotion. "I was so afraid," he said. "That day, walking up to your door, I was afraid you would turn us away, afraid I would fail my children, afraid that the world had no place for a man with nothing to offer. You had everything to offer," Eleanor said. "You just didn't know it yet." The years passed as years do, bringing joy and sorrow in equal measure. They buried Samuel's horse, old and gray, in the pasture behind the barn. They welcomed a daughter of their own, a girl with Eleanor's eyes and Samuel's smile, named Clara, after the grandmother she would never know but would hear about in stories told by firelight. They weathered storms and droughts and the hard winters that turned the ranch into a world of white and silence. And through it all, the ranch stood strong, a testament to what could be built when 2 people chose to believe in each other. When kindness was given without expectation, when a single act of compassion became the foundation for a life neither had dared to dream. Jacob grew into a man, tall and strong like his father, with hands that knew the land and a heart that knew its value. He took a wife, a schoolteacher from town with kind eyes and a gentle laugh, and they built a house on the edge of the property, close enough to share meals, far enough to build their own dreams. Ruth married a young lawyer who had come west seeking adventure and found instead a love that rooted him to the soil, and her paintings of the ranch hung in galleries as far away as Chicago, capturing the beauty of a land that had tested them all and found them worthy. Eleanor and Samuel grew old together, their hair turning silver, their steps slowing, their hands finding each other with the certainty of a habit that had become a need. They sat on the porch each evening, watching the sunset, remembering the past, grateful for the present, hopeful for the future. And when the time came, as it comes for all of us, they faced it with the same courage they had shown in life. Samuel went first, quietly, in his sleep, his hand in Eleanor's, a smile on his face that spoke of dreams that were sweet and memories that were dear. Eleanor followed him 3 months later, not from grief, though she grieved, but from the simple truth that a heart that has loved so deeply cannot long survive without its other half. They were buried side by side in the small cemetery behind the barn, near William, near Clara, near all those who had come before and made the land what it was. And on their shared stone, Jacob carved the words that had become the motto of the Barlow-Hartley Ranch, the lesson that had been learned in hunger and hope and the simple courage to open a door. A loaf of bread given in kindness can build a kingdom. The ranch passed to Jacob, and then to his children, and then to theirs, each generation adding their own chapter to a story that had begun with a widow's compassion and a father's desperate promise. The fence line that Samuel had repaired still stood, maintained and renewed, a visible thread connecting past to present. The barn he had patched sheltered new generations of animals, its roof sound, its walls strong, and the porch where Eleanor and Samuel had sat on so many evenings, where they had talked and laughed and loved, still welcomed the sunset, still offered rest to those who had labored through the day. In Amarillo, in the historical society that had been established to preserve the stories of the pioneers, there was a photograph. It showed a woman and a man, 2 children between them, standing in front of a ranch house that gleamed white in the sun. The woman was plain, her face lined by work and weather, but her eyes were bright with a joy that the camera could not fully capture. The man was tall and thin, his hand resting on the woman's shoulder, his expression one of quiet pride. The children smiled, the boy serious, the girl laughing, their clothes patched but clean, their feet bare but steady on the ground. Beneath the photograph was a caption, written in a hand that had learned its letters in a one-room schoolhouse and never lost the habit of careful script. Eleanor Barlow and Samuel Hartley, with Jacob and Ruth, at the Barlow Ranch, 1893. Their story reminds us that the greatest transformations begin with the smallest acts of kindness, that a single loaf of bread can be the foundation of a legacy, and that love, like the land itself, rewards those who tend it with patience and faith. Visitors to the ranch, which had become a place of pilgrimage for those seeking inspiration, would often ask Jacob, in his later years, what the secret was. How had his father known to approach that door? How had his stepmother found the courage to open it? How had 2 broken people, each carrying the weight of loss, managed to build something so enduring? Jacob would smile, the lines on his face deepening, his eyes distant with memory. "My father used to say that desperation makes us see things we might otherwise miss," he would say. He saw a woman who was alone but not defeated, a ranch that was failing but not lost. And my mother, Eleanor, though she was my mother in every way that mattered, She saw a man who was hungry but not dishonest, children who were suffering but not broken. They saw the best in each other, and they chose to believe in it. That was the secret. They chose. He would pause then, looking out across the land that had been his home for more than 80 years, the land that had tested him and taught him and given him everything he valued. People ask what the most important thing my father ever built was, he would continue, his voice soft but strong. They expect me to say the barn, or the house, or the fences that still stand after all these years. But the truth is, the most important thing he ever built was trust. He built it one nail at a time, one board at a time, one day at a time. He showed my mother that she could believe in someone again, and she showed him that he was worthy of that belief. Everything else, the ranch, the family, the life we lived, grew from that foundation. And the visitors would nod, understanding something they had not understood before. And they would leave with a story in their hearts, a story that they would tell their own children, their own grandchildren, a story that would outlast the fences and the barns and even the land itself. Because some stories are not just about what happened. They are about what is possible. They are about the truth that lives in the space between fear and hope, between despair and faith, between a closed door and an open heart. They are about the miracle that occurs when one person chooses to give what little they have, and another chooses to give everything they are. And together, they build something that neither could have built alone. The Barlow-Hartley Ranch still stands, though the world has changed around it. The city of Amarillo has grown, spreading outward like a tide, and the land that was once remote and wild is now bordered by roads and houses and the endless hum of modern life. But the ranch remains, a green island in a sea of development, protected by the family that still tends it, still honors the promise that was made so long ago. On the porch, where Eleanor and Samuel sat on so many evenings, there is now a bench, carved from the mesquite that Samuel once used for fence posts. It bears an inscription, simple and true. In memory of Eleanor and Samuel, who taught us that a loaf of bread given in kindness is the seed from which all good things grow. May we all have the courage to give and the wisdom to receive. And on summer evenings, when the heat has faded and the stars emerge in a sky that is never quite as dark as it once was, you can still sit on that bench and feel the presence of those who came before. You can feel the weight of their struggles and the lightness of their joy. You can feel the love that built a life from the ruins of loss, that turned a widow's despair into a family's legacy, that proved, once and for all, that the smallest act of kindness can change the world, because that is what Eleanor Barlow did on a hot Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1892, when a stranger came to her door with 2 hungry children and a promise that seemed too good to be true. She gave him a loaf of bread. She gave him her trust, and in return, he gave her everything. The ranch stands as proof. The family stands as proof. And the story, told and retold, generation after generation, stands as proof that love, like the land itself, can be restored, can be renewed, can be made to flourish, if only we have the courage to plant the first seed, to give the first gift, to open the door to a stranger who might just be the answer to a prayer we did not know we were praying. And so the story ends, as all good stories must, not with a conclusion, but with a beginning. For the legacy of Eleanor and Samuel is not in the past, frozen in photographs and gravestones. It is in the present, in every act of kindness that echoes their own, in every door that is opened to a stranger, in every loaf of bread that is shared with someone who has less. It is in the carpenter who fixes a neighbor's roof without asking for payment. It is in the teacher who stays late to help a struggling student. It is in the child who shares their lunch with a classmate who has none. It is in all of us, waiting to be awakened, waiting to be chosen, waiting to become the next chapter in a story that began with a widow, a stranger, and a loaf of bread that was given not as charity, but as hope. And if you ever find yourself in the Texas Panhandle, on a road that leads through mesquite and memory, past the places where the past still whispers to those who listen, you might come to a white ranch house with a porch that faces the sunset. You might sit on a bench carved from mesquite, and you might feel, for a moment, the presence of those who built this place from nothing but faith and hard work, and the courage to believe that love could grow in the harshest soil. And if you do, remember this. Remember that every great story begins with a single step, a single choice, a single act of kindness that seems small but is, in truth, the foundation of everything that follows. Remember that the world is full of strangers who are waiting to become family, of ruins that are waiting to become homes, of despair that is waiting to become hope. Remember Eleanor Barlow, who gave a loaf of bread and received a kingdom. Remember Samuel Hartley, who promised to fix a ranch and ended up fixing a heart. Remember Jacob and Ruth, who grew from hungry children into adults who understood the value of what they had been given. And remember that their story is not just history. It is an invitation to give, an invitation to trust, an invitation to build something that will outlast us all, something that will stand when we are gone, something that will remind the world that we were here, that we cared, that we chose, against all odds and against all reason, to believe in the possibility of love. The sun sets on the Barlow-Hartley Ranch, as it has set 1,000 times before, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. The fence line stands straight and true against the horizon. The barn stands solid, its roof sound, its walls strong. And on the porch, the bench waits, empty but not abandoned, ready for the next person who needs to rest, to remember, to believe, because the story is never truly over. It lives in every heart that chooses kindness over fear, hope over despair, love over loss. It lives in you, right now, in this moment, in the choice you will make tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Choose wisely, choose bravely, choose love, and may your own story be as beautiful, as enduring, and as full of grace as the story of the widow who gave a loaf of bread, and the stranger who fixed her ranch, and the family that grew from a promise, kept in the heat of a Texas summer, when the world was hard, and the future uncertain, and the only thing that mattered was the courage to open a door and say, with a full heart and an open hand, "Come in, you are welcome here, you are home."